There are moments in history when the things that gave us life turn against us. Moments when the quiet rhythm of nature, the sound of rain, the glint of a river, becomes the sound of destruction. For centuries, humanity has looked at water not as an adversary, but as a tool. We built civilizations along its banks, carved canals through deserts, and dammed entire valleys to bend it to our will. In doing so, we believed we had mastered it, that concrete, steel, and human will could tame one of Earth's oldest powers. But water remembers. It carries memory in its current, patience in its tides, and vengeance in its flood. And in the summer of 1975, in the heart of China's Henan province, that vengeance arrived. For 3 days, the skies refused to close. Sheets of tropical rain crashed over the countryside, transforming fields into oceans and rivers into monsters. Villagers huddled in their homes, listening to the drumming on their roofs grow heavier, then deafening, then terrifying. They didn't know it yet, but above them, just 25 meters of clay and iron holding back billions of gallons of water, a wall was starting to tremble. That wall was the Banqiao Dam, the pride of Mao's new industrial China. It was meant to be proof that socialism could outbuild the West, a fortress against the floods that had plagued China for centuries. But as the night wore on, that fortress began to crack. Engineers on duty saw the gauges spike, the water rising faster than they could release it. They sent messages to open the gates, the sluice valves that would relieve the pressure. But the command never came. Downstream, villages had already begun to flood, and officials feared that releasing more water would worsen it. So they waited. At 1 a.m. on August 8, 1975, the waiting ended. The dam's crest disappeared beneath the roaring black surface. Moments later, the structure gave way. 700 million cubic meters of water, enough to fill 500,000 Olympic pools, erupted through the breach, a wall of liquid earth 10 kilometers wide, moving faster than any human could run. It was over in minutes. The sound of the river swallowed the screams, the lights, the homes. Entire villages were erased before a single alarm could be raised. The people who had trusted that dam, who had believed the government when it called it the Iron Wall, were left to drown in the dark. In the days that followed, the flood would be described as a natural disaster. But nature alone didn't build the Banqiao Dam. Nature didn't silence the engineers who warned it would fail. This was a tragedy born not from weather, but from pride. The Banqiao Dam was more than concrete and clay. It was a monument to an idea, that humanity could dominate nature through ideology, through sheer willpower. And when that idea collapsed, it took with it more than 200,000 lives, and perhaps something deeper, the illusion that we were ever in control. This is the story of the Banqiao Dam failure, the day water turned against man. Long before Banqiao ever rose from the riverbed, mankind had been building walls against water. The idea is deceptively simple. Stop the river, store the rain, master the flood. But beneath that simplicity lies one of the oldest and most dangerous dreams in human history, the dream of control. Rivers shaped civilization. The Tigris and Euphrates birthed Mesopotamia. The Nile fed Egypt's crops long before the pyramids touched the sky. China's Yellow River, the River of Sorrow, built empires and destroyed them in equal measure. Every great society grew from a river's generosity and lived in fear of its rage. So humans learned to interfere. We dug trenches to guide the floods, piled stone to raise the banks. And when that wasn't enough, we built dams. At first they were crude affairs, mud walls and timber gates that shifted with the seasons. But with time, the walls grew higher, heavier, smarter. Stone became concrete, ropes became turbines. Dams stopped being barriers, they became engines. Engines that powered cities, irrigated deserts, and lit up entire nations. By the 20th century, the dam had become a symbol of progress itself. When a country built one, it wasn't just trapping water, it was declaring its arrival on the world stage. The Hoover Dam turned a barren canyon into an icon of American might. The Soviet Dnieper Dam promised electricity to the workers' revolution. And in the East, a rising China looked on with ambition. To control its rivers was to control its destiny. For thousands of years, floods had humbled the Chinese people. Dynasties rose and fell, not from wars, but from the Yellow River changing its course. In that sense, the Communist Revolution of 1949 wasn't just political, it was environmental. Mao Zedong promised not only to remake society, but to remake the land itself. Under his rule, dams weren't merely infrastructure, they were ideology in concrete form. They were proof that the new China could dominate nature the way the party aimed to dominate history. By damming its rivers, China could show the world, and itself, that the chaos of its past was finally under control. But control has a cost. Every dam changes more than a landscape. It rewrites an ecosystem. It slows sediment, it reshapes soil, it shifts weather patterns. The river obeys for a while, but it never forgets the shape it once had. Each wall becomes a test, not of the water's patience, but of our precision. If either fails, the result is biblical. And yet, to engineers and governments alike, dams carried an irresistible promise: immortality. They could outlast dynasties, stand against earthquakes, and outlive the men who built them. But buried in every blueprint is a truth no ruler likes to hear: that a dam is only as strong as the decisions behind it. If arrogance seeps into the design, no amount of concrete can keep the river still. By the early 1950s, Mao's China had begun to fill its map with dots, new dams rising across every province. Among them was a modest structure on the Ru River, a clay wall just 21 meters tall, destined to become a reservoir for flood control. It was called the Banqiao Dam. At the time, it was nothing special, one of dozens, but within that simple structure lay a fatal equation: inexperience, ideology, and a river that had been waiting centuries to reclaim its course. The stage was set, and soon China's long war with water would begin again. This time, not with swords or sandbags, but with the language of progress. China's story has always been written in water. Its rivers are more than veins of geography. They are living characters in its history, capable of giving life and taking it away. The Yellow River alone has shifted its course 26 times and caused thousands of floods since records began. For the Chinese people, survival has always meant negotiating with the river, not conquering it. But as history shows, that negotiation often turned violent. Floods in China have a peculiar tendency to arrive not only from the sky, but from men. In times of war, when armies faced defeat, they turned to the oldest weapon they knew: the rivers themselves. In 1642, during the Ming Dynasty, commanders broke the dikes of the Yellow River to repel an invading force. They succeeded, but the flood killed 300,000 civilians. The pattern repeated through dynasties, through emperors, through revolutions. Whenever invaders came, the water was unleashed. It was both shield and sword, an act of desperation that always ended the same way, with the people paying the price. Then came the 20th century, a century that promised progress but delivered ruin. When Japan invaded China in 1937, the nationalist government, led by Chiang Kai-shek, repeated the same ancient tactic. In a bid to halt the Japanese advance, they dynamited the levees of the Yellow River. 54,000 square kilometers were drowned. Over 500,000 Chinese civilians were killed. Millions more became refugees, not from war, but from water. The flood slowed the Japanese army, but it also drowned the government's legitimacy. Entire villages turned their anger toward the nationalists and their leader. In the chaos that followed, Mao Zedong's Communist Party, promising a new order, a new China, began to rise. By 1949, they had won, but their victory too would come with a flood. Mao's China was born out of the idea that man could finally conquer nature. The rivers that had humiliated emperors would now serve the people, or rather the party that claimed to speak for them. Floods, in the eyes of Mao's engineers, were not acts of heaven. They were errors of management, relics of the feudal past. All that was needed was modern science, collective effort, and an iron will. But ideology has a way of blinding even the brightest minds. In Mao's drive to industrialize, the land was reshaped without mercy. Forests were cut down for farmland. Hills were stripped bare for steel production. Soil erosion worsened, rainfall patterns changed, and the country's most flood-prone regions became even more fragile. The irony was profound. In trying to control nature, they had destabilized it. And yet, the belief in progress only grew stronger. When the party promised to build hundreds of new dams, people cheered. Each dam was a symbol of victory, another chain around a once rebellious river. Few questioned what would happen if those chains ever broke. Henan province, at the heart of China, was one of those places where the rivers met. The Huai, the Yellow, the Yangtze, all flowed nearby. It was fertile, dense, and vulnerable. Here, the government approved a network of dams to protect the region from the seasonal rains that had tormented it for centuries. One of those dams was to be built on the Ru River. Its name was Banqiao. No one could have known it then, but in choosing to build that dam, China had set the stage for one of the greatest tragedies in human history. Because while nature can be cruel, human pride is far more relentless, and when the two collide, it is always the people below who drown first. When the Chinese Civil War ended in 1949, the nation was exhausted. 2 generations had known nothing but invasion, famine, and civil unrest. Out of that wreckage, Mao Zedong promised something breathtaking in its simplicity. A new China, modern, industrial, self-reliant. The age of humiliation would end, and the people would no longer bow to nature or to foreign powers. In speeches, Mao said that man must conquer heaven. To his followers, it sounded poetic. To the scientists who understood what heaven actually was, climate, soil, water, it was a warning. Mao saw technology not as a science, but as a weapon of ideology. He believed that sheer human will could overcome the laws of physics. And so, when the party declared its great leap forward, the countryside became a laboratory of impossible dreams. Peasants melted down their plows to forge steel in backyard furnaces. Entire villages worked night and day, shoveling coal into crude kilns that produced nothing but brittle slag. Crops were planted too densely because officials insisted that collective effort could make seeds cooperate. When sparrows were declared enemies of grain and exterminated, locusts swarmed in numbers unseen for centuries. Nature, once again, was answering back, and it was not impressed. Still, the drive continued. Dams were to be built everywhere, symbols of the new era's faith in control. To question them was to question progress itself, a dangerous thing to do in Mao's China. In 1951, plans were drawn for a network of flood control and irrigation dams across Henan province. One of them, modest in scale but bold in ambition, would rise on the Ru River. The Soviets, China's ideological brothers, sent engineers and blueprints. The Banqiao Dam was to be 21 meters high, later raised to 24.5. Constructed primarily of clay, it would hold back billions of tons of monsoon water, a fragile wall against the unpredictable sky. At first, everything looked triumphant. By 1952, the reservoir was full and the party declared the project a success. State newspapers called it the Iron Dam. But cracks began to appear, literal ones, almost immediately. Engineers noticed seepage along the base, strange vibrations in the core. The Soviet advisors recommended reinforcement. Banqiao was patched with concrete and rebar, a quick fix masquerading as confidence. Among those who saw deeper was Chen Xing, a hydrologist of rare courage and precision. Chen warned that the dam's location was geologically unstable and that its reservoir could raise soil alkalinity, poisoning nearby farmland. He insisted the design needed 12 sluice gates, large spillways to release excess rainwater safely. Officials listened, nodded, and installed only 5. When Chen persisted, he was branded a rightist, a political enemy. He was removed from the project and exiled to another province. In the culture of fear that ruled Mao's China, silence was survival. No one wanted to be the next Chen Xing. So when the party announced that the Banqiao Dam was safe, no engineer dared to say otherwise. Safety reports were adjusted to match ideology, and the illusion of control solidified like concrete. By the early 1970s, Banqiao stood as a proud monument of progress, its reservoir glistening beneath the Henan sun. Farmers below trusted it. The party celebrated it. But inside that wall of earth and iron, water was waiting, pressing, seeping, remembering every shortcut taken in the name of faith. It would wait 24 years. And when the storm called Nina formed over the Pacific in the summer of 1975, all of Mao's dreams and all of Chen Xing's warnings were about to meet in one single night of rain. History rarely remembers the men who try to prevent disasters. It prefers those who survive them, or those who cause them. But in the story of Banqiao, there was one man who saw the flood coming long before the first drop of rain ever fell. His name was Chen Xing. Chen wasn't a revolutionary nor a politician. He was an engineer, quiet, methodical, and perhaps too honest for his own time. While others praised Mao's vision of conquering nature, Chen studied it. He measured soil density, tracked rainfall, and ran calculations that told him what no one wanted to hear. The Banqiao Dam, as designed, was not safe. In his reports, he warned that the local geography, loose sediment, flat terrain, unstable banks, was unfit for a high-capacity reservoir. Too much stored water, he said, would increase alkalinity and ruin the surrounding farmland. More dangerously, the dam's small number of sluice gates could not release water fast enough during heavy storms. If rainfall exceeded expectations, the reservoir would overflow, and once it did, there would be no stopping it. 12 gates, he advised. That was the minimum. Anything less was gambling with lives. But in Mao's China, engineering was not judged by equations, it was judged by ideology. To suggest that a party-approved design was flawed was to question the revolution itself. Chen's colleagues urged him to soften his words. He refused. When his report reached higher offices, it was met not with gratitude, but with suspicion. Criticism was equated with sabotage, caution with cowardice. In 1957, Chen Xing was officially labeled a rightist, a term that carried the weight of exile. He was dismissed from the Banqiao project and reassigned to another city. His warnings were buried in archives, his calculations ignored. The party, meanwhile, revised the blueprints. The 12 sluice gates became 5 openings to guard an entire province. 5 throats for a river known to devour kingdoms. The new dam was hailed in propaganda posters as the Iron Wall of Socialism. To the public, it was a triumph, a symbol that China had finally mastered the floods that had plagued it for centuries. Behind closed doors, engineers whispered their doubts, but none spoke aloud. After all, silence was safer than being right too soon. Through the 1960s, Mao's campaigns deepened that silence. The Great Leap Forward collapsed into famine. Millions starved, yet the dream of progress marched on. Resources were scarce, maintenance minimal, and records of dam inspections grew thin. Still, reports described Banqiao as stable. To admit otherwise would have been unthinkable. By the early 1970s, time and weather had begun their slow work. Sediment built up around the dam's base, clogging its drainage systems. Deforestation upstream accelerated erosion, feeding silt into the reservoir. Each year, the river grew heavier, the water darker. Still, official slogans painted Banqiao as the people's guardian. Chen Xing, now older and largely forgotten, could only watch from afar as the same arrogance he'd warned about hardened into national policy. He once told a student, "Rivers have memories. If we ignore them, they will remind us." It sounded poetic then, prophetic now. In August 1975, when Typhoon Nina's rains began to fall, messages were sent to open the sluice gates. Officials hesitated. Downstream flooding was already severe, and no one wanted to bear responsibility for worsening it. Orders were delayed by hours, the kind of hours that decide history. By the time approval came, it was too late. The 5 gates that should have been 12 were half buried in silt, barely functional. Behind them, the reservoir was swelling, whispering the same message Chen Xing had tried to give decades earlier. You cannot stop the river. In late July of 1975, the Pacific Ocean began to stir. Far from the Chinese coast, a pocket of warm air rose, condensed, and began to spiral. At first, it was just another tropical depression, one of dozens that formed each year. But within days, it gathered strength, feeding on the ocean's heat until it became Typhoon Nina. Meteorologists tracked it as it moved west, gaining speed and mass. By the time it neared Taiwan, its winds were screaming at 250 kilometers an hour. A Category 4 storm, vast enough to blanket an entire nation. The people of Taiwan braced for impact, boarding windows, tying down rooftops. When Nina made landfall, it tore through the central plains, flattening thousands of homes and uprooting entire forests. But luck, or geography, spared the island's capital, Taipei. As it crossed the mountains, the storm lost power. By the time it reached mainland China, it was little more than a tropical storm. Officials exhaled. The danger, they thought, had passed. But storms are not simple things. They are alive, and like rivers, they remember. As Nina drifted inland toward Henan province, she collided with a cold front moving south from Mongolia. That meeting, warm moisture against cold air, trapped the storm in place. It could no longer move. For 3 days it hovered over central China, wringing itself dry. When workers hurried to crank the sluice gates open, they found that the gates were clogged with silt and debris. Only a fraction of the water could escape. Inside the dam, vibrations deepened, metal creaked, pressure gauges trembled and spun. Outside, the rain continued, a constant roar that drowned out human voices. Some workers tried to flee, others stayed, determined to hold the line. They knew what would happen if they failed. By midnight on August 8th, the water had risen 30 centimeters above the dam's crest. The surface rippled over the top, spilling down the outer wall like molten glass. Moments later, a deep groan echoed through the valley, the sound of earth and metal surrendering. No one had time to run. The Banqiao Dam, once hailed as the iron wall of socialism, split open like paper. The river, long restrained, finally reclaimed its freedom. It was not an explosion, but a detonation of water. 700 million cubic meters of it, thundering into the darkness below. And the villages that slept beneath that dam would never wake again. It was just after 1 in the morning when the mountain began to move. For hours, the men stationed at the Banqiao Dam had listened to the rain pound against the concrete, feeling each tremor in their boots. Then came a sound that didn't belong to rain, a low, guttural crack, deep and final. In the next instant, the dam, once called the Iron Wall, simply ceased to exist. What followed wasn't water in any familiar sense. It was destruction made liquid. A wall of it, 10 kilometers wide, 7 meters high, burst into the valley at nearly 50 kilometers an hour. The night sky turned white. Towns, villages, and farms that had stood for generations vanished in the time it takes to take a breath. No alarm had been sounded. There were no sirens, no broadcasts. Only the roar of the flood itself, a sound so vast that survivors later said it didn't seem to come from the earth but from the air, like thunder that wouldn't stop. In the first minutes, more than 80,000 people were swept away. Entire families died still clutching each other. Houses were peeled off their foundations, trees uprooted like weeds, bridges torn apart like string. The sheer force of the torrent ripped train cars off their tracks and carried them for miles. Those who survived the first wave climbed whatever they could, rooftops, telephone poles, trees. But the water kept rising. It carried with it oil, livestock, gasoline, and the remains of villages now turned to splinters. Fires broke out on the surface of the flood, burning among the floating corpses and debris. Farther downstream, the chaos only multiplied. The Henan Dam, already at its limit, collapsed under the pressure, sending another wall of water cascading into an area the size of a small country. Dozens of smaller dams followed, 62 in total, a chain reaction of failure that turned central Henan into an inland sea. From the air, pilots later reported what looked like a lake stretching to the horizon. 3 million acres of farmland disappeared under the brown surface. In some places, the flood measured 12,000 square kilometers across. Villages that once had names now existed only as coordinates beneath the waterline. And yet, for days, the outside world knew nothing. The Chinese government sealed the region, forbidding journalists and foreign aid. To admit the scale of the disaster would mean admitting failure, that Mao's dream of conquering nature had drowned in its own reflection. Inside the flood zone, the survivors suffered in silence. Those stranded on rooftops drank rainwater to stay alive. Parents clutched children on floating doors, drifting through a landscape they no longer recognized. Bodies decomposed in the heat, poisoning the water. Outbreaks of dysentery and cholera began within days. Food was scarce, medicine non-existent. In the weeks that followed, helicopters airdropped supplies, rice, water, bandages, into isolated pockets of survivors. But for most, help came too late. The official count would later claim 26,000 dead, but independent estimates placed the toll at more than 230,000 when disease and starvation were included. No one knows the real number. The archives remain sealed. The people who lived through it rarely spoke of it again. When they did, they didn't talk about the dam or the party. They talked about the silence that came after. The way the night seemed to hold its breath, as if even the earth was stunned by what it had done. The Banqiao Dam was meant to protect. Instead, it became a monument to a lesson humanity keeps refusing to learn: that nature cannot be commanded, only respected. And when we mistake domination for control, it is not the powerful who pay the price, but the people sleeping downstream. When the waters finally receded, Henan province no longer looked like a province. It looked like a scar. Villages that had existed for centuries were erased. Fields that once shimmered with rice now lay beneath a crust of cracked silt and twisted steel. The air smelled of mud, rot, and diesel, the scent of a nation trying to bury what it could not face. For the survivors, there was no mourning period. There were only tasks: bury the dead, burn the carcasses, wait for food to fall from the sky. The army arrived with orders but little understanding. Their mission was not to document the scale of the catastrophe. It was to contain it. News of the disaster was classified as a state secret. Reporters were turned away. The international press heard only whispers: a localized flood, temporary loss of life. No mention of the hundreds of thousands swept away in a single night. For the government, admitting fault was unthinkable. The Banqiao Dam had been Mao's dream made manifest, a symbol of human triumph over nature. To acknowledge its failure was to confess that ideology had limits, that nature had the final word. And so, officially, the event was recorded as a natural disaster, a freak act of weather, an unavoidable tragedy. But behind that narrative, something shifted quietly. In 1989, 14 years after the collapse, China's Ministry of Water Resources conducted a private study. It concluded that 85,000 people had died in the initial flood, and as many as 145,000 more succumbed to starvation and disease afterward. It was an admission, albeit buried in technical language, that the disaster had been man-made. The survivors knew that long before the paperwork did. They remembered the ignored warnings, the broken gates, the officials who hesitated until hesitation became death. They remembered how it wasn't the storm that killed their families. It was the silence of those who could have spoken. In the decades since, China has built tens of thousands of new dams. Many of them are older now than Banqiao was in 1975. Engineers inspect them constantly, reinforcing their walls, adding the spillways that Chengxing once begged for. But the race to control the rivers never truly stopped. At the turn of the century, China completed the Three Gorges Dam, the largest hydroelectric project on Earth. It generates immense power, yes, but it also holds back more water than any structure ever built by human hands. Scientists have raised quiet alarms about its weight, its pressure, its ability to withstand a once-in-a-century flood. And somewhere beneath all the confidence, the shadow of Banqiao lingers, a ghost that still waits in the water. The legacy of Banqiao isn't just measured in death tolls or engineering manuals. It lives in the moral reckoning it forced, a reminder that progress without humility is a form of hubris, and that the line between control and catastrophe is as thin as a dam wall under pressure. When historians look back on the 20th century, they often speak of disasters defined by fire: Hiroshima, Chernobyl, Challenger. But Banqiao was defined by silence, no flash, no explosion, just rain. Endless, relentless rain, and the quiet belief that humanity could hold it back forever. Yet nature doesn't rage. It waits. It listens to every promise of mastery, and when the time comes, it reminds us who built whom. For the people of Henan, that reminder came on a dark morning in August 1975, when the river finally spoke, and no one was left to answer.